G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you what you need to consider if you want to permanently loosen stiff hips. So what I want to do in this video is I obviously want to show you some really simple exercises that you can do that should instantly make you feel like your hips become looser. But like I'm trying to do with a lot of the videos in this series, if we aren't also taking a step back and trying to understand why your hips have become stiff in the first place and try and improve that as well, then you may never set the conditions to permanently fix this hip stiffness long term. Now, it goes without saying, if you're someone that has suffered an injury to your hip, some damage, you've torn something, you've broken something, or you're just a victim of arthritis, it's really important to understand that that may not exclude you from improving how flexible your hips feel. So regardless of whether your hip is quote unquote normal or you have some other issues going on with your hip, we still want to go through the same process to see how much we can optimize that hip joint, including improving the environmental stuff that we'll get to towards the end of the video, just so that you can know exactly where your endpoint might actually be and you don't have to guess or have someone make that assumption on your behalf. So let's get into it. So as always, the very first thing that we need to go through is that we need to establish an initial baseline of how stiff your hips actually feel, so that after you do each one of these exercises, you can immediately come back to this same test to gauge whether something has actually changed. And one of the reasons why this is really important is because stiff hips are so closely related to so many other dysfunctions that I would treat clinically as a physiotherapist. If you have lower back pain, knee pain, or lower leg dysfunction as a whole, having one restricted joint within a broad range of function can be the piece of the puzzle that has to short circuit for something around it to become dysfunctional. So if you do have a bit of a dodgy back, or you have a bit of a bad knee, and you experience those symptoms when you do a specific movement or an action, please use that as a test and a retest and come back to that after doing each one of these exercises. If you don't, a really simple way to do that is to get you to basically lie down and just bend your hip as far as you feel comfortable. We should be able to get somewhere close to 135 degrees, if not more, which essentially comes to the point where your knee can basically get to your rib cage or your chest. And what's also important to remember is that your hip is not just a joint that bends in one plane, where you bend your hip or flex your hip where your knee comes to your chest. It also rotates in different directions as well and extends behind you as well. So while you can certainly take note of how far you feel your hips rotate in different directions, it can sometimes be good to do a functional test as well, potentially in the form of a squat, to see how that makes you feel. So another really great way to get a quick test of how your hips feel is just to drop down into a deep squat. The key is to always pay attention to how straight your feet feel, and obviously how deep you feel you can go before you feel like something needs to change in some way to allow you to get down to the bottom position of that squat. It might also be worthwhile to do something like a lunge, because that allows you to take your hip into hip extension to get a good sense of how tight you feel in that direction, as well as a deeper hip flexed position. And now that you've got a general sense of how those stiff hips feel to begin with, let's get to some exercises that will hopefully make you feel a lot looser. So the first exercise that we want to go through is a banded hip joint capsule stretch. So one of the misconceptions that I see a lot as a physiotherapist is if your hips don't move as far as you would like them to, we often assume that it's tight muscles that restrict you. And while this certainly can be the case, and any number of hip muscle stretches might help you feel like your hips are more mobile, unless we're going after the deeper hip joint capsule and trying to improve how that moves, then in theory, all the superficial structures on top of that will not get permission to stay loose long term. Now you can certainly do these hip joint capsule stretches without a band, but the band just allows you to bias the joint that little bit more, making them that little bit more effective than doing it without. So all you need is a power band, and you can generally get these from any sporting goods store these days, but you're welcome to use the TheraBand or TheraTube as well. And as we mentioned before, your hip has the capacity to move in so many different directions. So we just want to make sure that we are looking after the hip joint capsule as many different angles as you can find, just to get a sense of where you might be restricted compared to someone else. If you can take your band, secure it to something that's relatively strong and sturdy, and we want to basically get that band up as high into that hip crease as you can, and then we want to basically basically pull ourselves away, getting as much tension through the band as we feel comfortable. Now, obviously, if it feels uncomfortable for you to put your knees on the ground, then please put a pillow or rolled up towel underneath. You can do these exact same exercises in standing, leaning over a bench. You'll have your knee straight and you're going to do the same principles that we're about to discuss. On all fours is having your opposite leg back behind you and trying to keep your shoulders and your hips together. We basically want to slide everything back towards the band, imagining that your thigh bone is pressing out the back corner of your hip. Now, obviously, you'll need to come out a little bit wider if you need to get enough tension on the band so that when you come back, you still feel like there's some pressure through that hip. A quick disclaimer, you should never feel any groin or hip joint pain when doing this. If you do, it might mean you've closed that hip joint down too far and you might need to come out of that a little bit further, looking for that gentle pressure. But once you've found it, we just want to stay here for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes to give that tissue a chance to change and accommodate. You're welcome to oscillate in and out of that range if you want to. Just make sure that you don't divorce your hips from your shoulders and drop them down. We just want to make sure that you keep everything the same, shift everything across sort of parallel with the ground until you feel that gentle pressure, and then hang out here until it starts to give. And then once you've done that, we want to make sure that, as I said before, that we're biasing different parts of that joint capsule. So from here, the second part of this exercise is if you can cross your leg underneath and put that hip into external rotation, we can then block that back knee, and then same thing again, we're shifting back towards the band once again. But this time, instead of feeling some pressure in your hip potentially at the side of that hip, you might feel it a little bit further around the back where your back pocket might be. And same deal, we want to hang out here, find the version of this stretch that gives you the best access to some of that deeper joint capsular restriction. And then again, once we've done external rotation, we then need to do the opposite. Coming out of that again, this time we want to take our foot and our leg and rotate it into internal rotation. And this often sounds a bit strange that you're taking your foot outwards, so it's internal rotation. But essentially we're rotating your hip inwards, which sends your leg out to the side. And from here, we want the same thing. We want to make sure that you come down as deep as you feel comfortable. This internally rotated position is often a little bit more aggressive for some people. So you might find that instead of being deep into that hip flexed position, you might need to come out of it a little bit more to take some of the tension away from the groin. Put it on the outside front of that hip. So same deal again, leg out as far as you can, shift across again, hips and shoulders together. Find the position that gives you the best access to that tightness without any symptomatic soreness as well. And again, hang out here, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever works for you. Then once you've had enough of that, then just gently unwind yourself and then stand back up again, and then just drop down into the same deep squat that you did before to see whether you feel like that hip feels any looser than it did before. Same thing as well. If you pop onto your back again and then bend your hip up as far as you feel comfortable. Now, obviously I did my left hip in the demonstration, but having done my right hip here, my right hip just feels like it goes that little bit further with more comfort than my left does. But as we mentioned, please make sure that you assess that for yourself. Immediately recheck the baseline tests that are most meaningful to you. And let me know in the comments down below which one of those 3 variations made you feel the best. And once we've addressed some of the hip capsule restrictions in that position, there's 2 more versions of it that we need to get to as well. And so while those initial hip joint capsule stretches tend to go after a lot of the restrictions through your hip around the outside of the hip, we also want to go looking for some of the restrictions that might be directly behind that hip that might be influencing your ability to bend forwards without including your back, or lift your hip without bending your back as well. And as I mentioned before, freeing up some of that deeper hip joint capsular restrictions might allow you to be able to use your hips more effectively, which may in turn then allow you to use your back and your knees that little bit better as well. And so how this one looks, we can take the same band, pull that again right up into the base of that hip crease, stretch it out as far as you feel comfortable, and by putting your foot up onto a chair and allowing your knee to come out a little bit as you bend forward over the top, you should start to feel that there's some pretty intense tightness where your butt cheek crease meets the top of your thigh. And what we can get you to do from here is same deal from before. You go hunting around for where that tightness feels like it might be for you. You can gently bend and flex, again, through your hips, not through your back. Bending your back doesn't add anything to this. You want to make sure that you're imagining that you're taking your butt cheek off the back of your thigh each time. Again, you can stay here for 30 seconds or a minute, but again, if we can try and get a little bit of pressure through there, some oscillation through there as well, you might find that that hip starts to move that little bit further and further and further than it did before. Now, Now with this particular exercise, because we're genuinely biasing that hip flexed position, when you come out of that and then drop straight down into your squat again, you should automatically feel like your bottom gets down that little bit easier than it did before, especially more so than the other side. Because we've tried to take away whatever handbrake there might be at the back of that hip joint that's limiting your ability to flex that hip successfully. And this version of the exercise, as simple as it may look, is potentially one of the most important variations to go through, as is the next one as well. So once you've taken the time to go looking after the outside and the back of that hip joint, we can now turn our attention to the front of that hip joint. And clinically as a physiotherapist, tightness and restrictions at the front of the hip joints are easily some of the most common and most underrated, especially when we're talking about back pain, knee pain, hip and groin pain, or anything in between. So taking the same concept as before with your band, we want to place the band this time high up into the back of your hip crease, just underneath your glutes at the top of that thigh. We want to take the band back as far as you feel comfortable into this high kneeling position. Again, if this feels uncomfortable for you to put your knee on the ground, please use a towel, please use a pillow. You can definitely do this in standing as well, but you'll definitely get a little bit more out of this if you can anchor your knee to the ground. So we just need to make sure you have enough tension on the band that when you come back and then gently come forwards, you can still feel the band pulling. You should feel a very specific line of tightness or an area of tightness at the front of your hip. So same deal as before, in a linear plane, you can just take your hip forwards, again, without feeling like you're arching your back. You want to make sure your trunk's nice and straight. Imagine that you're genuinely trying to open up the front of that hip. We can hold this position again for 30 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever works for you. We can oscillate in and out of that range if it feels comfortable. What we can also do is we can rotate your trunk without your leg moving and just see which angle gives you the best access to some of that restriction. And for me, I'm not too bad in this range, not too bad in this range. But when I turn this way, I really feel as I come towards the inside of that groin area, there's a little bit more tightness here than I would like. So again, I can just oscillate in there until it starts to reduce. I start to go further and further and further than I could before. And then again, same concept as before. Once you've had enough of this particular exercise, come out of that shape, try your squat. And although we spent time working on taking your hip behind you, releasing some of the restriction there may also allow that hip to bend more in that direction. Obviously, you may notice more of a difference with this one when you do a lunge, because this obviously is the same shape that we were in. But as I said before, make sure that you recheck the same tests that you were doing originally to get a strong sense of how much this specific variation of a hip capsule stretch has impacted you. And then as we've mentioned before, it's one thing to have viable strategies that instantly make you feel like your hips become loose. But the next thing that we need to discuss is how to make sure we stop it from coming back. So for a lot of people, one of the main reasons why our hips become stiff is we just don't use that full range. And again, we'll get to one of the common reasons for that in a second. But if you've taken the time to successfully mobilize those stiff hips and you genuinely feel like they're looser than what they were previously, the next thing that we need you to do is use them and fatigue the muscles around those hips through whatever available range that you have. And for me, one of the best ways to use your hips is, as we did before, is just with a basic lunge technique. And the reason for this is that not only does a lunge allow you to drop your front hip down as deep as you feel comfortable, but it often gives you an opportunity to extend your back hip at the same time. So while things like traditional squats are fantastic for overall hip strength and fostering the deeper ranges of that hip flexibility, the one downside to squats is that it doesn't put your hip into a position that goes through full range into extension. So for you, we want to follow basic strength principles, 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 12. Do this in any way that feels appropriate to you. If you're not comfortable doing lunges, you are most welcome to start with a relatively sort of smaller stance, hold on to something, and just drop down as deep as you feel comfortable, making sure that your trunk stays up nice and tall. Imagine that you're dropping your back leg down as low as you feel you can. If it's only a little bit to start with, that's perfectly fine. Because as your range improves, so should your ability to perform a lunge. And if you feel like getting all the way down to the bottom of the lunge is relatively easy for you, then we want to make sure that you start to change the demands of how deep you can get down into that range in both directions. So obviously taking your back leg further and further back can definitely make a big difference, but also taking your front hip into deeper and deeper hip flexion as well. So you may need to come further forwards as opposed to just dropping straight down. But the value of a lunge is that it hits a lot of the different ranges that you need to have a healthy functioning hip long term. And as I've mentioned, if you're working hard to mobilize those stiff hips successfully, we then need to make sure that you use that range to its full capacity consistently over time. But we also need to go after one of the main contributing factors for why your hips have become stiff in the first place. And clinically as a physiotherapist, probably the number one cause of stiff hips is sitting. So ultimately, the key to better understanding why your hips are stiff and what you need to do to give yourself the best chance of permanently keeping those gains that you're making is that we have to pay attention to your sitting load. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to sit at a desk all day to make this happen, although for a lot of people that's a reality. Sitting, unfortunately, is a theme that binds so many of the activities that we do throughout the day together. We get up and sit on the edge of the bed, we stand up, we go and sit on the toilet, we stand up, we sit at a table to eat breakfast, we get up, we jump in the car and sit to drive to work. Some people have to sit at work all day with the odd break to stand up and move around, but then we drive home again. And then for a lot of people, we can often end up sitting on the couch to recover from all the sitting that we've done throughout the day. And if you are someone that identifies as having stiff restricted hips, if you aren't taking a step back and considering the sheer amount of time you're spending in this same hip position, asking your joints to stiffen up, then again, all the mobility, all the strength, all the conditioning work that you may do may never ultimately overcome the sheer amount of sitting that you might be doing. And while it may be unrealistic to click your fingers and not sit as much, we haven't invented standing cars yet, being mindful of this alone can be a huge step in just modifying and introducing less sitting into your day. It goes without saying that if you are someone who has the opportunity to stand at work, please do that more often. If you find that you are a truck driver or someone who's forced to be in that sitting position all day, it may just mean that it could be more appropriate for you to take more breaks and stand up. Don't just inevitably sit down again to relax. And on top of that, you might need to do some of these mobility exercises that we've gone through more consistently throughout the day, either before or after work or both. But ultimately, if you're consistently asking your body to be in this shape and never really getting into a position where you're expressing deeper ranges of your hip in all directions, then again, it's unrealistic for your body to maintain and curate that range if you don't use it. While the cliche, the stereotype of use it or lose it, probably gets a little bit stale after all these years, it's still genuinely applicable. It's just sometimes it may not be as instantly obvious to you when you're going about your day-to-day life. So with all that being said, I genuinely hope that this video was helpful to give you that bigger perspective of what you may need to do in order to give yourself the best chance of permanently loosening your stiff hips. Please let me know in the comments down below which exercise and which idea you found resonated with you the most. If you found this video helpful, please consider leaving a like rating on the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of these types of videos from me. Please consider leaving a super thanks if you want to help support me and the channel moving forwards. But ultimately, I do genuinely hope that that was helpful for you and hope to see you next time.